should be the one clapping.
Good
afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to Seward House Museum's Lunchtime Lecture Program. My name is Billy Chabot, Executive Director at the Seward House Museum. Joined today by our colleagues, Jeff Ludwig, Director of Education, our newest staff member, Walker Goodamote, Information and Communications Coordinator. We shortened it and call it IC. I also just want to encourage everyone, if you're not already a member of Seward House, don't miss out on membership. That way you'll know all about our upcoming programs. We'll have a newsletter coming out in about the next week or so, but we have a full program coming up for the summer. This is our last kind of springtime lunchtime lecture series. And in a minute, I'll be talking about where we're going to be moving it to, but I think you probably know that. But one thing I did want to highlight for you to mark on your calendar is Sunday, June the 8th. We will be welcoming the Friends of Lafayette. And on June 8th, in 1824, Lafayette visited Auburn, and he was greeted by the Auburn Masons and also by a very young William Henry Seward. And so they have a wonderful Lafayette reenactor that's going to come to Auburn that afternoon, and we're going to be hosting them over at the Seward House. The Auburn Civic Band is going to be playing some revolutionary themed music. Then the Lafayette reenactor will come out and give a speech. And then the last hour of the day, we'll just host a community open house. So please mark your calendars for Sunday, June the 6th. Also, I want to let you know that our Shakespeare in the Garden series is coming up again this summer. And it is the only place where you can see live outdoor Shakespeare in Cayuga County. We're doing 2 performances this year in partnership with Syracuse Shakespeare in the Park. And the first one is Othello. So if you didn't make it to New York City to see Denzel Washington on Broadway for Othello, we will be doing that on June 18th at 6 o'clock. And the last one is August 12th, and it's 12th night. And our own Maria Coleman, Director of Development, is performing in that show. So those are just a couple of the things we have coming up that I wanted to highlight for you today. That'll all be in our newsletter. Of course, it'll be out on community calendars. But again, if you're not a member, and I see most of you are, but if you're not, I did lay some membership brochures over here for you to take. We'd love for you to join us, and we really, really appreciate your support. Now it is my extreme pleasure to introduce today's program, and someone that probably doesn't need any introduction to most of you. How many were at our ribbon cutting last week? Yeah, most of you were there. It was really wonderful last Friday to finally cut the ribbon on the wonderful Barn and Carriage Rehabilitation program that honestly had been on the to-do list for Seward House Museum for well over a decade. And it just takes time in historic preservation to get things done. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of patience. And someone who embodies patience and has helped me become more patient, although I often fall short, is our speaker today, Mr. Mitch Maniccia. Mitch started as an intern at the Seward House Museum 11 years ago this summer, and 2 years ago was elevated to the position of Director of Operations. And I couldn't be any more prouder of Mitch than I am. And his tenacity and dedication to this project was just incredible. And it wasn't easy, and we learned a lot, like we always do with these types of projects. So I could talk some more, but I'm not going to. I'm going to turn it over stone by stone with our Director of Operations, Mitch Maniccia. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy, for that wonderful introduction. And just to be clear, I have 4 hours to talk about this. 6? Great. If anybody has any questions over the course of the presentation, feel free to ask. Working at a museum, it's always important to know history and how we got to where we are right now. And it's no different when you examine the Barn and Carriage House Rehabilitation Project. And how the project became so successful was part of why it was so successful. And as we were writing grant applications, and I say we, it really was a collaborative effort between multiple staff, Jeff especially. I don't know if you know this about Jeff, but he's a fabulous writer. So his edits on the grants were instrumental in our getting them, focusing on the history of the Barn and Carriage House specifically. For a very long time, it was just the main house. And as I'll get into later in the presentation, the Barn and Carriage House were really afterthoughts, not just as part of the historic landscape, but also as part of the story. But they tell many layers of the Seward story, just the Barn and Carriage House themselves. So why did the buildings need preservation? Why are they significant to begin with? Well, with most of the things that we say on a 1-hour tour of the Seward House, it all begins with the election of 1860, which was supposed to be the year that Seward was elevated finally to the presidency. He had been a national figurehead in multiple parties up to that point. He was the most experienced statesman in Washington. There have been entire books written on Seward's ability to keep the country together during the secession winter between the election of 1860 and Lincoln's inauguration. So he was second to none in Washington at the time of the presidential election of 1860, but his hopes for the presidency came with a lot of political baggage. Among them, his support of immigrants and his stance on slavery and wanting it to be restricted to the South and eventually terminated. And all of that came to a head on April 17th, 1860, during that election year, when the original, I'll call Barn and Carriage House complex was burned in a case of arson. And it was about 6:45 p.m., according to Will Jr., Seward's son's recollection of the incident, that he was downtown having tea and supper when he heard fire alarms. And he rushes home, and between the first fire alarm going off at about 6:45 and before 7:50, the Barn and Carriage House complex were gone. It only took 4 minutes for the buildings to burn to the ground. 2 horses died in the fire, and a certain number of cows actually broke down the fence to run for their lives from the blaze. And there's more about this story that I'll get into in just a few minutes, but you can imagine the panic that was going on. And when I say Barn and Carriage House complex, it was likely multiple buildings very close to the main house. And if you know anything about the 18th or 19th century, fires were dangerous. They could easily burn down entire towns. So multiple buildings going up at once and being ashes in minutes was probably terrifying, to say the least. And it was all sourced in opposition to Seward running for the presidency. Immediately upon the rubble from the original Barn and Carriage House complex being cleared, the family set to work on redesigning the successors to the Barn and Carriage House. And in the lower left is a letter that Frederick Seward, Seward's middle son, writes to his mother, Frances. And there's a presentation to make about how Frances was really the one in charge for many years at the Seward House. Seward himself, Frederick, as I'll get into in just a moment, the other children are constantly selling their ideas for preserving the house, putting additions on, doing things in the gardens. If Frances does not give it the green light, it does not happen. And Fred, in this letter, justifies his design for a new Barn and Carriage House. And he's writing from Albany in the spring of 1860, so just a few weeks after the original Barn and Carriage House complex are gone. He's already come up with an idea of what buildings should be built to replace them. And he says in this letter to his mother, Frances, that his design, his favorite one, is the most expensive, but it will be the most conducive to their needs at that time. And it called for a single stone barn and a single stone carriage house. And he explains that the placement of the windows are just right so that the street lights on William Street lets light into the building, so you don't need any interior lighting. There's paddocks and loft space for storage, or maybe some personnel who work out there. Also, the carriage house was completely hollow, so there was a massive pulley system inside that would allow a servant to raise the carriage up, just like mechanics do with cars today, so they could work underneath it. So a really thoughtful design for the buildings, and he concludes the letter by saying, really, this is up to you to decide if this is what you want. Oh, and by the way, I hear whisperings that the Republican nomination is going to work in our favor. So it's a really nice synopsis of the kind of letters that the family writes to one another, where they cover things from architecture to what their needs are as a family to politics. So it's a really fabulous letter that Frederick writes to his mother. And the barn and carriage house are also an opportunity for the family to store items that there is no room for in the main house, specific to William Seward's diet, which I'll get into in just a few moments. And William Seward Jr., who is really the superintendent of the site after his parents have passed away, makes a number of changes to the barn and carriage house, especially once his father passes away. He puts a second floor in the carriage house once carriages are no longer drawn by horses and automobiles are becoming more and more popular. A car wash is installed in the barn, and he alters the buildings quite a bit physically that eventually led to some significant structural failures, thanks Will Jr., that made us embark on the project the way that we did. And then William Seward III, the last Seward to live on the site, maintains his father's, Will Jr.'s, renovations as best he can, but it's really hard to maintain a big old property like the Seward House. It's one of the reasons that the home is bequested by William Seward III to the Emerson Foundation rather than it staying in the Seward family. There's a lot of maintenance, a lot of deferred maintenance especially, on the property, and the barn and carriage house were no exception. It was in rough shape. When Billy started at the Seward House in 2010, she had to throw up emergency shoring in the barn basement because the building was going to go down. It was going to collapse because the framing members were just that rotted and deteriorated. And it was a good fix. It kept the building together for a while after that. But when I started in 2014 and the Seward House was expanding operations and it really needed more space outside the main building, they were not getting any healthier. They were rough. Had anyone been through the barn and carriage house before the project? Had a chance to see the insides? Okay, so you know firsthand what those buildings were like. I mean, we were bringing garbage out there before we brought it to the curb. It was not anywhere that the public needed to be or really wanted to be. But at the same time, Seward House needed space. Its operations were being enhanced. We were doing more and more inside the main house, programs not unlike this one. We just needed room to grow. And the barn and carriage house were the perfect opportunity to expand those operations. But what's a nonprofit historic house museum supposed to do? I mean, there's a lot of work here. To do anything with these buildings, to keep them around for any length of time is a job in and of itself, but to rehabilitate them for museum use was going to be a heavy lift. Well, what the Seward House Museum did is made a plan, a thorough one. The first core planning document was a historic structures report done in 2007. And so what I've tried to do with this chart is on the top are all of the core planning documents which built the case for grantors, funders, supporters to see that Seward House wasn't just pulling these needs out of thin air. There was good, solid evidence that justified that these projects, specifically the barn and carriage house rehabilitation project, needed to get done. And on the bottom are grants that the museum received that help further the project along. And from 2007, when the Historic Structures Report was done, and the Historic Structures Report is basically a thorough investigation of a building explaining how significant it is historically. But the most important part of that document is the final 10 or 15 pages, which outlines recommendations for enhanced use. And one of those recommendations at the end of the Historic Structures Report was rehabilitating the barn and carriage house. And so as the Historic Structures Report informed the next report, which informed the next one, and the next one, and the next one, the burden of proof for the barn and carriage house project became insurmountable. And so it took a long time, as Billy said, to finally crack our first grant, or string of grants, towards the barn and carriage house project, which started relatively modestly, a $10,000 Preservation League of New York State grant. And then we leveraged all of these institutional plans, 2007 through 2015, to justify funding for our first Environmental Protection Fund grant, which is a New York State Parks grant. That was for a different project, for the woodshed, but it at least allowed us to break into the state park system and start building a relationship with that agency so that we could leverage more money from them in the future. The big one was in 2018 when Auburn received the Downtown Revitalization Initiative money. That was a watershed moment for the museum, an unprecedented $863,000 in funding for design and construction of the Barn and Carriage House Rehabilitation Project, and everything else just fell into place from there. We were doing building condition reports, updating our strategic plan regularly, and then in 2021, another huge string of successes, a Save America's Treasures grant on our first application, which is unheard of in the historic preservation industry, another Environmental Protection Fund grant, $250,000 through the American Rescue Plan Act, courtesy of the City of Auburn, and then Inflation Reduction Act and New York State clean heat rebates, which Seward House was able to receive because we utilized a geothermal system for the Barn and Carriage House project. So I think the most important thing to showcase here is that it takes a long time to break into this funding, but once you do break into that funding, and of course you regularly update your strategic planning documents, you can keep going back and building your case. And one of the first things we had to do once we were able to start working on the Barn and Carriage House project is archaeology. We had to make sure that we weren't going to disturb anything in the ground once we started construction. And it told us a lot, some new stories that we hadn't known before about the Seward family and the Barn and Carriage House site. So when I said complex earlier, I meant complex. In all likelihood, there was a wood-framed barn, a wood-framed carriage house, and a wood-framed shed. So at least 3 buildings near the main building that were used before the current stone barn and carriage house. And the family used these buildings for extra storage. There was no room in the main house for the people that lived there, let alone the extra stuff it takes those people to use. So all the extra plates and furniture that were not used inside the house were stored temporarily in these outbuildings. And what happened during the fire was that there was a scramble to rescue as many of those things as possible. Now, could they manage to save the horses and the furniture and plates? I don't know. But the horses didn't make it, some of the plates did. They made every effort to save as much as they could. What archaeologists discovered is that there was a whole bunch of plates and bowls and bottles, different kinds, smashed in fairly large pieces. So what likely happened was, in the 4 minutes between the fire started and the buildings were gone, the family was taking armfuls of things out of the carriage house and sprinting to the main house, which Francis writes about in a letter, dropping things as they walked. So there's literally a trail of things from the original site to the main house that they found. And you can see some of the bowls and plates there that they tried to rescue but couldn't manage because they were just working that fast. And they also discovered some new things about Seward's diet. In all the kitchen mittens they found, there was an abundance of oyster shells and root beer bottles. So as much as we say that Seward knocked back the brandy, in all likelihood he was knocking back a lot of root beer and shelling Hudson Bay or Hudson River oysters, which I've been told were a delicacy in the 1840s when oysters were a huge export from the Albany area. So Governor Seward chugged oysters from the Hudson River and drank copious amounts of root beer. That was the secret to his success, in addition to the fat Cuban cigars he smoked down. So boy, things smelled good inside the house, I bet. So we did learn a lot, and there's a picture there of the archaeology before the project started. And because we were successful in getting lots of grants, we had to answer to a number of different agencies. And as we were approaching the start of construction, we were feeling more and more ready to embark on construction, but we needed a green light to not only select a contractor, but actually start work. And because we were fortunate enough to receive grant money from multiple agencies, we were lucky enough to have to secure 4 green lights to start the project, not just one. But it taught me a lot about open communications with agencies, providing very thorough amounts of information just so that they could make an informed decision to allow us to move forward. And we were finally able to move forward on the project in October 2023. And things were off to a great start. The first thing they did, and by they, I mean LaChase Construction out of Rochester, who were fabulous during this project. The first thing they did was drill geothermal wells. And I didn't know anything about what geothermal meant when this project started. I've only seen drawings of it from the architects and engineers. But I learned that how geothermal works, and maybe most of you know this, but I had learned it, was you send water through a closed pipe system into the ground, anywhere from 200 to 1,000 feet into the ground. And the water is cooled to 53 degrees, and then it gets brought back up into mechanical units inside your building. And depending on what season it is, that 53-degree water is kept at 53 degrees for air conditioning, or it's heated up just a little bit during the winter for heating. So you're still providing some conditioning of that water, but it's a lot lighter of a load for a system to heat 53-degree water a little bit or keep it at 53 degrees, and then it goes right back into the ground where it gets turned into 53-degree water again, and it just keeps cycling through that loop system all the time, forever. It's a very efficient system, but it's messy to install because they have to drill these massive holes in the ground that the piping goes down into. And originally, the project had called for 4 1,000-foot deep wells. Or no, I'm sorry, 4 500-foot deep wells. And as I said, they can get it anywhere from 1,000 feet or more. So 500 seemed manageable, and we only needed 2,000 feet of line in the ground. 4 wells. Not bad, we can manage that. And I remember the driller saying to me, to my face, "This is the best I've ever seen on a job site. This drilling is going amazing. It's never this easy." And I believed him. I shouldn't have, because on that hole right there, they hit gas at about 200 feet down, a pocket of gas. I wasn't here when they hit it, but it was like a 50-foot tall water feature, a massive explosion coming back up. That was the first challenge for the project, that we found out we were going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what we were going to do. Were we even going to be able to do geothermal still? Because it called for 500-foot deep wells, and here we are not able to go 200 feet in the ground. Fortunately, the design team came up with a pretty simple solution that I can call simple now. Just drill more holes at more shallow depths, and that's what we did. So rather than 4 500-foot wells, we have 10 200-foot wells. So it worked out perfectly. We were still able to do geothermal, and things were going well until I was in my office and I get a call from Zach, who was the job supervisor. And Jeff knows, and any of you who have taken the Haunted History Tour know, that a favorite story we like to tell is that when the barn and carriage house burned down in 1860, they took the carcasses of those horses and buried them under a walnut tree. And that was something the Sewards did. They just buried all their animals under this walnut tree. It was a cemetery. Well, when I picked up my phone that day in October of 2023 and said, "Hello, Zach, how's it going?" and all he said was, "We found bones," I was panicked. Were they human bones? Were they animal bones? How deep were these bones? I ran down and they uncovered quite a few animal bones, but they were butchered. So it was a kitchen mitten, a garbage pit that they uncovered. But because we found something at all, we had to get an archaeologist on site and monitor the rest of the digging we had to do for the geothermal wells. So for about a week after that, we had an archaeologist on site watching every ounce of dirt come out of the ground just to make sure there wasn't anything else uncovered. And fortunately, the contractors were perfectly fine with this. The archaeologists were great to work with. They understood we were trying to stick to a timeline and a budget. But what they discovered when we started digging more and more is some stone foundation, probably from the original barn and carriage house complex, that ran from where the barn and carriage house are now to about the main house. So whether that was a retaining wall of some kind or the foundation for a much larger barn and carriage house complex, we don't know, but it was something we had no idea was there, and it was quite a large structure originally. So we did learn some new things from that archaeology digging. The next thing to happen was the result of Will Jr.'s alterations to the barn from the early 1900s. And what he did was he carved out a huge piece of the basement and put in a new basement access door. And that left one string of the barn foundation supporting 2/3 of the building's weight. And it did not hold up for more than a century. And so once the structure that was abutted to the barn was taken out from the wall, the structure was untethered and the barn started collapsing. And so we had to throw up emergency shoring in the basement, which is what this framing is here, and emergency shoring on the outside of the barn, and there was total work stoppage while this happened because the contractor was afraid that if even one stone was moved a little bit out of place, the whole barn would collapse. And so we had to stop and think about what we were going to do to rebuild the barn. And so here in this middle picture are executives from the contracting company, the structural engineer, the project architect, the mason company, everybody who was going to be involved in this part of the project. We had on site several hours for several days just looking at it, thinking about what we were going to do to keep the barn upright. But fortunately, because we kept lines of communication open, everyone was honest with one another, and we prioritized getting the job done right, regardless of what it cost, frankly. We were able to come up with a solution and embark on that, and obviously the barn is still standing. And I'll get into the details of how they rebuilt everything in just a few minutes. But once the geothermal well solution was found, the archaeology came back all good, and we had a solution for rebuilding the barn wall, everything was back on track. So here we have the carriage house, with selective removals, walls being exposed. And if you were at the ribbon cutting and you saw the new offices up in the carriage house, you'll know that that's not the layout that it is now. So we moved around some of the walls and doorways to accommodate the new use of the carriage house. But then more problems. So if any of you own an old house or have ever worked on an old house, you know that the fun truly begins once you start opening up walls and you realize how clever and creative people were in the 1800s with framing, and that's exactly what we found in the carriage house. So the picture on the left are beams that we assumed ran the whole length of the carriage house, but somewhere along the line somebody chopped them up and put in just a piece of wood to keep them together. Not anything that's safe to walk on, so that needed to be fixed. And we had to go back to the drawing board again and figure out how we were going to beef up the framing for the carriage house so that we can put mechanical equipment in and I can go up and down the stairs and not have to worry about falling through the floor. So it was quite a challenge, but our architect and engineer were able to come up with a solution. And just when you think that was a hurdle that once we got over, we'd be in the clear after, think again. When we update the electrical and plumbing system for the barn and carriage house, we had to drill holes through the foundation of the house to feed the conduits through to go out to the new barn and carriage house. Well, the Seward house is on compacted clay, undisturbed compacted clay. So centuries of clay compacting on itself creates a rock hard surface, and water just skims right over the top of it and it dumps into South Street. And for many years, yeah, it was a problem when our driveway washed out into South Street, but at least that water wasn't going into our basement. Well, when the contractor excavated out the foundation to put in these new conduit lines, they essentially created a bowl. And all that water that had previously gone on top of that clay down the driveway now went into that bowl and through the stone foundation. And so there was quite a bit of water going into the basement, a lot of water for a long time. On top of that, the same time all that happened, we had to have the windows abated because they had asbestos in the glazing. So the glazing on the windows had to be removed. Well, the abaters weren't that careful when they were removing the glazing from the windows and broke some of the original glass from 1860. So what do? We have to get glass that looks old, right? So we find a company in New Jersey that makes old-looking glass. And we get a sample, and it looks like shower glass from the 1980s, not something that we're going to use at the Seward House Museum. So after our project architect finds a source in Germany, we're able to order restoration glass from this company in Germany. And the abaters who broke all the original glass agree, after some arm twisting, to pay the full price of this restoration glass from Germany. So that was a huge cost savings for Seward House. But by that point, for those of you who are familiar with the curse of Francis, I was thinking that this job might be cursed. That it just seemed like one thing after another. And then the flooding started. The holes in the foundation where the conduits came in through the house too. That middle picture right there, that's Zach from La Chase. He's our job supervisor. He was getting ready to leave for the day. So it's about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and I come down to the basement to check on the situation, and it's bad. I mean, there's water everywhere. I said, Zach, we've got to do something to patch these holes. We can't leave it like this overnight. And it, of course, is the spring, and it's or maybe it was the fall, I don't even remember. It was raining, and so there's just water coming in from the basement. And so Zach calls an electrician, a person who worked on the job that lived closer than anyone else. And an electrician comes in, and he's patching the basement walls around the conduit with this fast set concrete, and water's just gushing in. It literally reminded me of those cartoons where like you have chewing gum on the dam and water's still coming through. He'd patch one hole and water would find another way in. He'd patch that one and water would find another way in. And I'm like 3:30, 4 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, and there's water still coming in. And so I tell Zach to just go home. I tell the electrician to go home. I throw dehumidifiers on. And for the next couple of nights after that, I don't know if Billy knows this, every hour I would come in. I live right around the corner. I would set an alarm on my phone. Every hour I'd come in, empty the dehumidifiers, check the basement, go back home, get 45 minutes of sleep, come back to the Seward house, empty the dehumidifiers, make sure things weren't flooding. And it was a couple of nights of that. And then the rain stopped. And then we were able to excavate out the foundation from the outside, seal it up, regrade everything, put fabric down to shed water away from the house, and that seemed to do as good a job as we can hope for to keep the water out.
I just have a quick question, because they got a little mixed up here. The water was going into the Seward house or in the
Seward house, yep. But after all that, we're finally back on track, and things are finally going the way we want them to. And it actually worked out because we're not able to work on the barn because it's falling apart. So the contractor was able to focus exclusively on the carriage house. They essentially did one building at a time. They were able to do everything in the carriage house and then move over to the barn and do everything in the barn. So it actually worked out pretty well. And you can see here that as the situation with the barn corner got resolved, we were able to start doing some cement work on the retaining wall. Things are being cleaned up in the carriage house. Porches are being built on the carriage house. Drywall is going up. And a really cool part of the project was when we repair the barn wall, we needed to match as best we could the original stone so that it wasn't a stark difference. And you probably can't tell which stone is which in the top picture. So the top picture is new stone and the bottom picture is original stone. And we found a vein of Onondaga limestone outside of Albany that we sourced all the limestone for this project from. The same exact limestone, just in a different part of the state, that we were able to match exactly to the original stone on the barn. And our project architect found that connection. So, I mean, this is, when the project went well, it was going well. I mean, matching the stone identically to the original stone was pretty exciting. And then things just kept snowballing from there. By the spring and early summer of 2024, we were really hitting our stride. We had masons on site who were fixing the corner of the barn. They knew exactly what they were doing. The staircase in the carriage house is a single piece of steel. And the contractor who installed it came October, November 2023, right when the project started. and he took measurements of the space before any demolitions had really been done. And when the steel staircase stringers were delivered in the late spring, early summer 2024, it literally slid into place perfectly. No shims or anything, like the perfect fit, down to the millimeter, a perfect measurement on the steel staircase. So I mean that, and then our project architect is the first one, other than that guy, to walk up the stairs. Thumbs up, he was really happy, I was really happy. It was a good stretch of work going on at the Barn and Carriage House. And then the namesake of the presentation, Stone by Stone, Doug Ward and Tim Ireton, the two masons who worked on this job, are superheroes. They literally hammer cut by hand every single stone to rebuild the barn wall inside and out, and then all the stones on the retaining wall and ramp that go down into the barn basement, each and every stone hammer cut by hand to fit perfectly one on top of the other, laid expertly to create a seamless new addition and historic original. And it took a lot of stone. I mean, you can see in the lower left there, dozens of pallets with thousands of tons of Onondaga limestone from Albany that were used to replicate everything. And they did a remarkable job. I mean, in the picture right here, that's daylight. So there was literally a hole in the corner of the barn, and they rebuilt the whole thing with the rest of the barn there. Just unbelievable craftsmanship, and frankly bold engineering to say, yeah, we can rebuild that and we're going to do it, and they did. So just an incredibly proud moment to see them rebuild that. And an interesting side note, every trade that worked on this job had an apprentice. The electricians had an apprentice, the general carpenters had an apprentice, the masons had an apprentice, the plumbers had an apprentice. So with all these problems that are arising over the course of the project, what was rewarding for me was seeing these veteran craftsmen scratching their heads, and they're looking to their apprentice like, what the hell are we going to do about this? And they come up with this collaborative approach, and both are learning how to solve these problems, which historic preservation always has problems. But they were able to take it in stride and work together. It was just incredibly rewarding to see that mentorship and personal growth on behalf of the teachers and the mentees. But the moment that I was waiting for was the removal of the barn floor, which was the original 1860 floor with steel I-beam reinforcements and then a foot of concrete poured on top of that. So the barn floor had a belly on it when we started the project, and it was going to go at any minute. Although it might not have gone at any minute, because one of my favorite stories of this project was myself, the preservation architect, and the structural engineer going down into the barn basement at the start of the job. And the preservation architect, Jack, and I are telling the structural engineer, this is bad. This floor needs to go. It's going to go at any minute. We really shouldn't be down here right now. And what does the engineer do? Takes out his hammer and starts whacking away on the steel I-beam. Oh, it's not that bad. There's only a little bit of steel falling off. And Jack and I are like, please make it quick. Just don't let us be alive for too much longer under this floor if it falls on us. It didn't fall on us, obviously, and we ended up having to take the whole floor down. And these guys that did the work, I mean, it was the hottest day of 2024 when they were in there slinging sledgehammers and moving huge pieces of concrete. It was a sweat box in the barn. It was miserable. But they did a great job removing everything, and it was really cool to see the entire barn opened up like a cathedral almost. And they rebuilt the floor. Heavy timber framing tied together with like 200 nails in each joint. And it's really fun to bring contractors down to the barn basement right now, because they look at these ties holding the frames together, and there's 100 nails in each tie. And when we were demoing the carriage house, the framing members in the carriage house only had 2 or 3 nails in it. But the nail heads were like this big. So you can imagine these wiry Irish guys in the 1860s just slinging sledgehammers, hammering these railroad ties in to these pieces of tree And today we just use clean ties with 100 nails in each one, and these guys are putting in railroad ties at diagonal angles in the 1860s. So it's interesting to see that evolution in construction through this project. But when LaChase came in and rebuilt the floor, they were dealing with a lot of variables, right? This barn has moved around a lot. It's stone walls with plaster over that, so it's a bit wavy. There's a lot at play here, and they have to build a perfectly square and level floor in the barn. And they do it. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the project. I took a 6-foot level and set it in the middle of the barn floor as soon as they were done. And you could not get any more level than that. Just amazing construction ability from these guys to take this building that had seen 160 years of settling and moving, and they do that in it. Just really great construction ability. And then after all the problems, we're really hitting our stride. Everybody's knowing how to work on this job. They know that at any minute they could uncover something, but they're ready for it. We start doing the site work and focusing on plantings and getting closer to the finish line. And one of the coolest things during the site work phase is that picture on the left. So this company that did the work, they don't need manpower anymore. Everything is done with computers and satellites. So their bulldozers and excavators are plugged into GPS systems. And this guy walks around with a little computer, and he's able to tell the bulldozers and excavators via satellite data that when you reach a certain elevation or a certain distance, don't dig anymore. So the bulldozers and excavators know within an inch when to stop digging based off of satellite data. They literally would not go any deeper. So it's like driving around a remote control car, and everything's done via computer and satellites now. So they were precise working on the site work, which allowed it to finish a lot sooner because there was a lot less guesswork and having to make sure everything was at the right elevation. They knew it. As soon as they dug out some topsoil or added topsoil, they knew immediately that they were doing the right thing. And then we started setting in all the pathways and even the lines in the concrete pathways, which direction they were going to get cut, received attention. This is our landscape architect right here. She was on site for hours telling the concrete contractors which way to cut a line and how it was going to be at play with other lines they were cutting in the concrete. And every decision that was made at this point was given careful thought and attention so that when it was all done, everything blended together and looked as good as possible. So it was really exciting to see everything come together. And then the sidewalks themselves are really cool to see poured. It's called exposed aggregate. So concrete's a mix of stones and stuff held together with binder. But what this company did is after they poured everything, they put that spray on, that yellow spray you see in the upper left, which prevents the top 1/4 inch or so of cement from curing. And then they go through with a pressure washer and they pressure wash off that top 1/4 inch of cement. So all the stone and stuff inside the concrete is exposed. And depending on how exposed you want it, you put more or less of that curing retardant agent on it. And so that's how we're able to get that really historic stony look to the walkways, because they stopped the top 1/4 inch of concrete from curing, sprayed it off, and then sealed it. So really interesting techniques being used here. And even this, the pebbles around the storm sewer, because we were going to mulch all this, but we didn't want mulch washing in to the storm system, so that little rock collar prevents mulch from washing in to the drainage system. And that was an idea that one of the landscapers came up with, that he had seen on another job, that even our landscape architect wasn't really familiar with. So just the cleverness and creativeness of all of these people approaching these problems was just awesome to see. And then the sod we put down was like a chef's kiss on this project. It was just excellent to have that put in right at the end and have it come in green and lush in time for the ribbon cutting. And then the steel storefront doors, which I'll get into in just a minute, right here, that was the first thing we ordered on this project. It was a 52-week lead time. So we put that order in right away. And they came in at about a year after. In the fall of 2024, they finally arrived, and we were ready to put them in the barn and carriage house and get the glass installed in them. But the contractors doing the installation for these doors were out in the bitter cold, trying to caulk the doors and make sure everything looks as good as they can in 5-degree weather, but they did it. And then finally some interior painting. And it looks like we're going to finish on schedule. Until, I've said it before and I'll say it again now, the most creative person on the face of the earth is the general public visiting a museum, and they are behind the wheel of a large automobile. They will go wherever they want, sometimes where you least expect them to. And in December of 2024, on this new sod, new landscaping, we had someone accidentally drive right over it onto the new sidewalks and pathways and get stuck in the grass. But we were able to pull them out, and you would never know that that had happened now because the sod was still fresh, so it healed itself over the winter. But that was a day. That was a day. And then the glass for the storefronts were supposed to be in the same time the storefront doors arrived. Enter the curse of Francis. On their way here from Pittsburgh, for reasons nobody knew, they shattered. Never happens, right? Completely shattered, destroyed. Dust in the box when they arrived. So we had to reorder the glass. And just when we thought we were going to finish in December 2024 on schedule, we're telling our granting agencies, yep, we got it. Glass is on the way. The doors are in. We'll close everything out. We get that news that the glass had shattered en route and that we'd have to reorder glass. But fortunately, we were able to put plexiglass in instead temporarily, just so the buildings could be sealed up so we can test the heating and the cooling system, and that brought the project to the finish line. And then there's the ribbon cutting from last week right there. So I was thinking a lot about how to explain this project, and there's a lot that I could have touched on. I could have talked a lot more about how the Seward House embarked on all those core documents and received all the grant funding we did, which is an amazing accomplishment. I could have talked about how important historic preservation is. I could have talked more about the Seward story and how historically significant these buildings are. I could talk about how great it is that the Seward House finally has these buildings, but I figured the best way to frame this project is frankly talking about all the problems over the course of the project, but that the result, no matter what, was always going to be this. And so I think that speaks volumes to the kind of project it was, to the kind of organization Seward House is, where, yeah, you're going to have people driving over sod, or you're going to find structural failures. You're going to have water in the basement from time to time, but you're also going to have solutions to those things, and you're going to come out on top in the end. And I think Seward House certainly did with this project. And here's some pictures from the ribbon cutting here. Light years ahead from where these buildings were originally. I wouldn't have imagined the barn ever being able to look like that. Every time Jeff and I brought a bag of garbage out there for many years, I don't think either of us looked at each other and said, you know what, this is what it's going to look like someday. Nope. Or the carriage house for that matter. And when Seward's Carriage is finally back in there, potentially later this year following conservation, it'll add a whole new layer to people's experiences there. So with that, thank you everyone for coming today, and I'll open the floor up for any questions if you have any. Yeah, you way in the back.
What was the total cost of the project?
Total cost was $3.1 million. That includes a contingency that Seward House had set aside. And that doesn't include all the pre-development design work we had done before the project. Yeah, Romy.
Where did you get the archaeologists? Did you pay them?
Yeah, we had to pay them. The archaeologist is Harkin Archaeology. They're out of Rensselaer. We've used them before. They actually did our cultural landscape report in 2015. But our project architect knows them from Albany, and they're the archaeology firm in New York State. They do a ton of work with the State Historic Preservation Office. So they actually communicated with the New York State Preservation Office the entire time they were doing archaeology for us. So they were acting as our liaison, essentially, keeping the state in the loop as they were doing the monitoring. And that took a big weight off of Seward House's shoulders, because it's a lot to communicate with the state. So if you can have somebody do that for you, that helps. Yeah.
The redesign of the geothermal system increase the cost of that part of the project?
No, we didn't have a change order for increasing the amount of wells being dug. The only change order we had associated with the geothermal wells was that they lost some equipment in one of the holes. They dropped a tool down there or something, I don't know. That was it. So fortunately it did not, we were concerned that it would, but it didn't.
And it works well.
It does, yeah. Getting it online and working properly has had some challenges, and I noticed just the other day that 2 of the zones are labeled incorrectly, but that's an easy fix. We shouldn't have to dig anything up for a long time.
Is that for the whole complex, or is it just for the...
No, and it's a good thing you mentioned that. So it's just for the barn and carriage house. However, when we were designing this project, we thought about putting in geothermal wells for the main house and just doing 2 birds, 1 stone sort of deal. And that became too expensive for this project, but we're working with an engineering firm right now called Quantum Engineering. And they're also out of Albany, and they are a renowned mechanical engineer company. They've done Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. They're in the middle of doing all of the HVAC for Mount Vernon. And so we were fortunate enough to get them to design a geothermal HVAC system for the Seward house and for the main building. So if everything goes according to plan, we are hoping to install a geothermal system for the main house, just like the barn and carriage house.
I don't know if you know this or not, but we installed geothermal at City Hall.
Yep.
And we hit water too. But we oversized the well system there, and we put in some extra wells that could be used for things like the Shy Theater or something else in the neighborhood. So.
That's good. Yeah, way in the back.
And you thought about putting your presentation in a book or something?
Publish? Well, Seward House has been, yeah, it's a great suggestion. Seward House has been fortunate enough to present the project to the Museum Association of New York. We did that in April. Just in the past couple of weeks, we presented at the statewide preservation conference in Poughkeepsie, and then in September we'll be going to Cincinnati to present to the American Association of State and Local History. And we partnered with other sites for those presentations, but I think right now, since it's still quite fresh, we'll stick to conference sessions, but I'll talk with Jeff about publishing. We'll add it to the list of things to publish. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks.
That was amazing. Mitch and I have worked together for almost 10 years, so I can attest that he's talked about this a lot over 10 years, sometimes exclusively, and I didn't know, but I don't doubt that he did get up. Probably also they were babies, but every hour to check on his biggest baby, which is the Seward House Museum. I want to thank all of you for coming, but I also really want to thank Courtney and everybody at the Equal Rights Heritage Center. For the last 2.5 years, this has been our home for the Lunchtime Lecture Series and all sorts of other programs. And now we have a new home, thanks to every stone left unturned and then turned over and then cut. So we're really excited to move over there. We're still going to be a friend and a neighbor and field trips and big tours. But it's been wonderful to have them always open up so graciously. I know many of you have been coming to this since the series started 2.5 years ago. Our first summer Lunchtime Lecture Series is going to be on June the 13th. It is a Friday. It'll be at noon. It will be in the barn, so if you didn't get to go over for the ribbon cutting, it's a good chance to see it again. We will test the technology that Mitch did not talk about, but there's chairs, those should work fine. But new toys to play with, we'll have a sound system and a smart screen. We're gonna put those to the test, and then the talk is gonna be from one of last year's summer interns, Alyssa Brown, who just graduated from UConn. Will share her senior thesis. She did some really interesting research, finding sources I didn't know existed, on Olive Risley Seward, who was the adopted daughter of William Seward, who travels around the world with him. She spent the last year of her life chasing everything she could find. I've read some of it, but not all of it. And if you've ever wondered, this is the title of her project is The Problem with Olive. She can be problematic in some ways, but the biggest problem was sources were really hard to come by. So we'll share that with us. As Billy's already mentioned, we do have newsletters coming out. Hopefully, if you're all members, you'll get yours in the mail very soon. Come by and pick one up if you don't get one. And we hope to see you for all the lunchtime lectures, Shakespeare in the Gardens, programs galore. So thank you for 2.5 great years of this series to all of you, but especially everybody here at the Equal Arts Heritage Center. You've been so kind to host us all these years. And we're happy to help clean up.
Production facilities provided by Auburn Regional Media Access, ARMA.